Okay. I'm just feeling up because we're about to get into some serious shit today. Welcome back, everybody. My name's Rachel, and this is my book club. Okay, that's enough of that. Today, we are going to be talking about something I know we're all very excited about. And that's the Crescent City Trilogy. I can't even hold. I mostly want to talk about kind of the pros and cons of reading this series because it is a very long series. Each of these books is about 800 pages or more, and there is supposed to be more books coming in this universe. I kind of want to dive into if this series will be right for you. The third book in the Crescent City Trilogy was just released at the end of January, like a week and a half ago. It is one of the hottest fantasy series that you can get into right now. Sarah J. Maas has an absolute chokehold on fantasy readers right now, and especially romantasy readers. I know I personally have become absolutely obsessed with her. I read A Court of Thorns and Roses just last fall, and I pummeled through the rest of the series almost. And I was so excited to see that she had the Crescent City Trilogy and a new book coming out, so I dove into that one right away. And so I'm really excited to not only talk more about Sarah J. Maas and her works and her writing and how much I adore her, but also get into the nitty-gritty on if this urban fantasy series is right for you. Now, right off the bat, obviously, if you're a fan of Sarah J. Maas and you love her other books, it's definitely a safe bet. It's definitely Sarah J. Maas writing through and through, but it is different in a way that has turned some people off and has had some people kind of questioning if she's still going as strong as she was with Throne of Glass and A Court of Thorns and Roses. Now, don't get me wrong, I do love Sarah J. Maas, but these books are huge. In total, the first 3 books are almost 2,500 pages. So that's a lot of time and dedication, and there were some parts where I really felt that they were not worth that book length. In the briefest way that I can explain the premise of this series is that we're following our main character, Bryce, and she has disliked the Fae and the way that they've treated her whole life. And a lot of this series is her growing past these prejudices and learning to accept people that love her, as well as, of course, step up to the people in power and overthrow them and show them what's up. There is action, there is romance, there is discrimination, there is slavery. There is a lot to unpack with this series. And the things I mostly want to go over to kind of determine if it's worth reading, I'll be talking about the plot and the general storyline, and I'll be talking about the characters, and I'll be talking about the world building. These are the 3 biggest key elements, especially in a Sarah J. Maas and especially in a fantasy book that we want to look for. All right, let's get into it. Between storytelling, the characters, and the world building, I think the storytelling and the plot was actually the weakest of those 3 elements in this series. There's a few plot holes and some things that are left to be explained. As you get more into the series, you kind of understand there's this concept of a multiverse. Just like you have, with the Avengers and with Marvel, you have these kind of crossovers happening with other Sarah J. Maas universes and characters, and it does kind of show some missing bits and pieces of information. There is a lot of history, and there is a lot of people involved and wars. Like, there is a lot to build on. This story relies on the history of a lot of people, of characters that we are and are not familiar with. And this kind of leads to some gaps, some things that don't feel very well explained. And I think at the end of the day, the stories do have a great ending. I think they're resolved very well, but trying to build up to that climax, it seems like we miss a step or 2. Between the 3 books, I think the first book had the best storytelling. I think book 1 actually had the most interesting story to tell. Each of these 3 books within the larger sum of the series, of course, has its own little plot that it follows, unique to each book. I think the story in the very first book was the one that was thought out the most thoroughly. It's set up kind of as Bryce wanting to avenge the death of people she loves, wanting to figure out what happened to them, and that is what grows into the second and third book. But just that essence of Bryce grieving and wanting to figure out what happened to her friends is portrayed so strongly in the first book, and how all these details are laid out to throw our characters off track, to bring them back on track, to find out who actually did it. It's super interesting. It's really well thought out, and I really enjoyed reading it from page 1 to the very end. I was enjoying it. I would say the second book has probably the worst storytelling, kind of has the worst plot out of all 3 books. I found the second book the hardest to follow. The goals of the series as a whole were kind of unclear. The motives of a lot of the good guys and bad guys were unclear. And while I do believe this was a point that Sarah J. Maas was trying to make, that there was a lot of confusing things going on, I think it got almost so vague and cryptic that I started to lose interest in the story a lot of the time in the second book. Even though the story was very lacking in book 2, I found the characters that I really loved really carried that story to the end for me. In book 3 had a little bit good and bad of everything. The story was pretty good, and obviously the end goal is a lot more clear in the third book. We have a lot better idea of who our characters are and kind of what their purpose is in the story, and then we get to see that come to fruition in the end. That story is pretty good, even though there were some parts that I was really mad about that we'll talk about later. But there was still also those characters that I adored who were carrying the story, and so it came together very nicely, even though it wasn't perfect. To summarize, as far as the story and the plot goes in the series, it's good. It is hit or miss depending on which book it is, depending on which aspect of the story we're focusing on, but all in all, I did still enjoy it. One of the other things I want to get into is the characters. If there is something I can rely on from Sarah J. Maas, it is how much I love the characters. For me, nothing will ever live up to ACOTAR. Nothing will ever live up to Feyre and Rhys for me, just because that series came into my life at a perfect time. It really hit home for me, and I know that I'm really biased, and I know that nothing will ever live up to that for me because those books were just perfect. And I just love Feyre and Rhys so much, and I'm not over it yet. So one thing that was absolutely incredible about this series was the amount of POVs that we got. I love multiple POVs. I think it leaves a lot of room to get into more depth with each character. It leaves a lot more space for you to empathize with everyone involved, and you get a lot more ideas of what's going on, not just for our main 1 or 2 characters, but you get different aspects of people who are politicians, whereas POVs of Hunt, who is a warrior, or the POV of Bryce, who in the beginning of the series is a very normal person just trying to live her everyday life and doesn't understand what's going on. And so I think those are really important to the story because the world building in this series is huge. And so I think you kind of need a lot of those different perspectives in order to get a better idea of the environment and the setting that we're trying to get to the heart of. There is a lot of different houses within the city. There's different cultures and species, and being able to see that through different eyes is very important. And then I just kind of want to touch a little bit on what I think of a lot of the characters. I have a long list of characters that I felt were important, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about each of them. Starting with some of the more periphery characters, the ones that we don't get their perspective on, you have people like the Autumn King, you have Hypaxia and Jessica, you have Baxian and Adis and Apollyon and Isaiah and Naomi and Cormac. So there's a lot of these characters on the side, and something that's really powerful is that we get their backstory and we get to know them. So they play a very important part of the story, even though there's probably like a dozen of them whose POVs we don't get. And so I kind of have these characters grouped together by their purpose in the story. So you have Hypaxia and Jessica, who are there as supporting characters. They help our main characters out in a lot of ways. They provide skills, tools, information that they need at appropriate, convenient times sometimes. And so they're really important as far as truly supporting characters and making sure that our characters make it to the next page, to the next chapter, to the next thing. You have people like Baxian and Prince Idas and Apollyon, and they act as people who are there to back up our main characters in the central fight that's happening. A couple of characters I do want to talk about is Fury and June. Fury and Juniper. We don't get to know very much about Fury. That could be purposefully open-ended so that way we can dive into it in later books or whatever, which is cool. But we know that she does a lot of spying, assassinating. I think she could have been more important in these books than she was, and she seemed really interesting. And even Bryce compares Fury to Amryn, and that kind of mystery is so interesting to me, and I wish we could have known more, and hopefully we will get to know more in the future. I think Juniper deserved a lot more time in the spotlight than she got. Same with Feyre, because it's very clear that Juniper is incredibly important to Bryce. She is one of the only close friends she has left after some of her other friends die in the first book, and they kind of have some shared trauma, and Juniper even saves Bryce from harming herself, and she's an incredibly important person emotionally to Bryce, and I think she deserved a lot more time in the spotlight, and I would have liked to see Bryce and June interact a lot more throughout the series, but conveniently all these things keep coming up and Juniper's busy and then they're mad at each other and then whatever, so they don't really get to spend that much time together, which is really unfortunate because Feyre and June together are two of the only other female friends that Bryce has, and conveniently they are never around. Instead, it kind of felt like we got excuses for why they couldn't be a part of the story, and I wish it was not that way. I feel the same about Isaiah and Naomi for Hunt. Isaiah and Naomi are two people who have been through everything with Hunt, and they are probably two of the only people who can really understand the true depths of Hunt's past and his pain and his trauma, and again, they aren't really there, and conveniently Hunt doesn't need them all of a sudden. I don't know. Isaiah and Naomi not being present in the story is a lot more justified because they work for the government. That excuse makes a lot more sense, and I do think it's a lot more applicable, but it still would have been interesting to see more kind of intimate friendships and intimate camaraderie between the three of them at certain points, because it's very clear how important they were to each other at a point before the series, and then that seems to kind of get lost. The main group of people in this book: Bryce, Hunt, Rune, Flynn, Declan, Ethan, and Therian. So that's like 7 main characters. We don't get Flynn and Dec's point of view, but they are pretty much there all the time, so I would consider them main characters for sure. I'm gonna say something blasphemous, and I'm really sorry, but I do not like Bryce that much. I do not like Bryce that much. I really wanted to like her, and I do like her at certain points in the series, but all in all, she's not my favorite. And again, I do think part of this is just because I will never love anyone more than I love Feyre, but that's okay. She was incredibly strong and powerful, and she was smart and witty, and all in all, very badass and very awesome. However, I think there was certain points where she was a little too badass and awesome, and she was a little too brash, and she was a little too angry and a little too judgmental, and she has a lot of flaws, and I don't actually think they build her character in a way that was beneficial. Bryce just had too many flaws that I disliked. You know, they weren't flaws that humanized her and made me sympathize with her. A lot of them were flaws that just were annoying to me. This is hard to explain because she does change and grow quite a lot between the 3 books. I think I loved her the most in book 1 because we experience a lot of her grieving, a lot of her denial, and a lot of her coping with all of the events that are happening. And I think those are very powerful and important, but those get lost in the later books. And in the later books, it's almost like, well, now you know her trauma, so you just have to understand why she acts this way. I feel like I don't actually get a lot of emotional perspective from Bryce in the 2nd and 3rd book that makes me sympathize with why she makes the decisions that she makes. In the 2nd and 3rd book, it seems like instead of learning from things that happened in book 1, she just continues to make very impulsive, unsafe decisions in the 2nd and 3rd book until they magically work out. Until the end, like the end of the 3rd book, that she's finally like, no, I'm gonna be the person that I need to be to save everyone. Like, it takes way too long for her to become the person she's meant to be at the end of the story. And so I lost interest in her as a character like mid book 2. However, there was enough other characters and points of view that I enjoyed reading that I could just kind of ignore the parts about Bryce that I didn't like. The characters I like the most, I love Rune. I think Rune is perfect. The comparisons between him and Rhys, I think, are incredibly accurate, and I'm really, really happy that those comparisons were drawn even in the books, because he's so supportive of Bryce. He's an amazing brother. He doesn't give a crap about his title. He just wants the people that he loves to be safe and happy, and he'll do anything to make sure that the people he cares about make it out and all this stuff. I just adore him. I think that, we get a glimpse into his past and why he kind of abhors the Fae hierarchy, and he has this trauma from growing up and being hurt by his father and not being able to be there for Bryce, while also having the crushing weight of responsibility. And I just think he's awesome. I don't even know how to explain it. I just think he's perfect. So if there's any reason that you should read these books, it's for Rune. And I really hope that the fourth book focuses a lot more on Rune and Ethan, because Ethan was another one of my favorite characters, and I would love to know a lot more about Rune's story in the future and Ethan's. I also want to talk about Therion, so we get his point of view as well. In the first book, he's a pretty minor character. He is helpful, and he's definitely a side character, just kind of supporting some information and stuff in the first book. But in the second book, he really heads a lot of the story. He is the reason a lot of the story moves in book 2, and we get a lot of information about who he is and his past and his own, personal situation that he's stuck in. Outside of Bryce and Hunt, I think Therion's story was the one that got the most telling, like from beginning to end in this series. We get to know more about who he is as a character and his situation and his past, and through the series we see him grow and change, and we see him make terrible, stupid mistakes that his friends have to fix, and he moves the plot along in a lot of different ways. And in book 3, we get to see him kind of resolve some of those issues and come to a semi-happy ending. So there's still a lot more to tell with him, but he has more resolution than a lot of the other side characters, so that's good. I do really like him at the end of the day. I feel like we experience a lot with Therion, so I really loved him as well. So he is definitely top 5 characters for me. All in all, I think my very most favorite characters have to be Rune, Flynn, Declan, Ethan, and Therion. Like the boy crew, I really liked them. I think Flynn and Deck can use a lot more depth in future books. Hopefully we do get to see them. That group of boys had the most camaraderie, and there was a lot of jokes that I laughed at, and I just really liked their story, and they are the 5 characters that I want to see more of in the future as well. And then the third aspect of the books that I want to talk about is the world building. Now, there is an insane amount of world building in this trilogy. And if you've read this trilogy, you know the first book is like information overload. Each of these 3 books has a point where you're just getting bombarded with information, just bombarded. There is so much to understand about the ruling class, the Asteri, from how they have their hierarchies broken down with angels, to genetic breeding, to the different magic, to the clans, to the houses, to the wolves, to the sprites, to the slavery. Oh my gosh. There is an insane amount of potential, and that is this series' strongest point, is that Sarah J. Maas could write 100 books on this world and just introduce new characters, and she could just keep going in this same universe, because there is so much to unpack, and there's even more introduced in the third book. There's even more magic and more kind of elements introduced in the third book that we can go off of. There is so much to understand about the world, the universe, the setting, to really get what's happening in each individual book, what's happening in the series as a whole, and the potential for future stories. So I will say, if you're into fast-paced plot and a story that goes bang, 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 beginning to end, the series is not for you, because the plot of the series goes from long periods of world building, and then we jump to this side quest, then we jump to this side thing, then we meet this character, and then this character tells us this is actually what's going on, and then we get back on track with the plot for a little bit, and then this happens, and then this series may be the least straightforward plot I have ever read. So don't read it purely for the story, because that is the weakest link of the 3 things. If you like insane world building and learning about magic systems, this is a great series for you. There's a lot going on with the magic system. There's a lot of history to talk about with the world, with the politics. There's a lot there. So if you are into that aspect of fantasy, great idea. And most of all, even if you're half interested in those things, if you have any inkling that you will like or that you have liked Sarah J. Maas's characters in the past, then you will still enjoy these books. At the end of the day, these are very much Sarah J. Maas books. They follow a form of storytelling that she's very good at. They follow a magic system that she's very good at. She still is definitely playing to her strengths and trying to expand in a lot of ways. Some of them worked out really well and some of them did not, and that's okay. For me, these books were very worth reading, despite the fact that I almost didn't want to read the third book. Each of these books has a moment that made me absolutely sob. The amount of emotions I felt reading these books overcame a lot of the things that I didn't like. I think they are so good. I would say my quickest summary would be that I love Rune and Ethan the best, and I can't wait to read more about them. I really hope the next book focuses kind of on Ethan and his predicament at the end of the third book, if you know what I mean. And of course, I can't wait to read more Sarah J. Maas in the future. I just can't help it. Sarah J. Maas has an absolute grip on my soul, on my heart, on my soul, on my feelings. She knows exactly how to make me cry and be angry and feel all the things. So for my next video, I have two books I've really been wanting to read, and that's Masters of Death and Babel. And because I don't know which one I want to do, I'm gonna do a coin flip on here. I'm gonna do heads will be Masters of Death and tails will be Babel. Oh, heads, Masters of Death. So in 2 weeks from now, then I will be doing a video on Masters of Death. If you guys would like a more in-depth series of videos about these books, please let me know. I'd be happy to do them. Thanks again for tuning in. Don't forget to add me on Goodreads so I can see what you're reading, and I will see you next time.